We had begun to discuss in class the early history of Rome, and in this 10-minute screencast we're going to talk about some important developments presented by early Rome. Here we're looking at an aerial view of Pompeii, which was destroyed in the 1st century AD with the eruption of Mount Vesuvius. And it gives us a great opportunity to study Roman city planning, which is one of the great and very important innovations for the Western world, city planning. And the reason Pompeii is so important for this is that most cities founded by Rome, including Rome itself, continued to be used in later periods and were thus renovated again and again and again, so that the original Roman street plan is difficult to find often. Pompeii, however, since it was buried in ashes in 79 AD, maintains its original Roman layout. So first we'll talk about Roman city planning, and then we'll look a little bit at how they built their buildings. Every Roman city, whenever possible, was regularized and followed the same basic plan. Where topography allowed, it was based on a rectilinear grid, kind of like an XY graph that you might use in statistics or geometry class. There were two primary boulevards running through town. There was one that ran north to south, and this was called the Cardo. You see it here on the aerial views. And there was another major boulevard that ran east-west to the center of town, and this was called the Decumanus. Other streets around this then formed sort of parallel to that wherever possible, and became like your graph that you might use in plotting data. At the crossroads of the Cardo and Decumanus, at the intersection, was the Roman Forum. The Forum was a pedestrian mall open to the sky but covered around the sides. And you can see the remains of that here. This is the covered area around the sides. Here, the colonnades that you see were covered, and then it was open to the sky in the center. This was a pedestrian mall and a marketplace. The covered areas for perishable goods that might be damaged by the sun, and then the open area in the center just for light and air and whatnot. And inside this pedestrian mall, there would have been statues of local leaders as well, because this really was the civic heart of town. So colonnaded covered walkway around the sides. And also in the center of the Forum, labeled number 2 over here, there was a temple as well, a civic temple, dedicated to the great god of Roman life, Jupiter, the Roman version of the god Zeus from Greece. Remember that the Romans had adopted everything from the Greeks. So inside the center of commerce, there is also a center of religion. And this is the ruins of it here. You can see it's colonnaded on the front. There's a cell behind it. We'll look at that in class. And over here we see a reconstruction of what it would have looked like before Mount Vesuvius destroyed it, with statues of local leaders and our standard Roman temple. So what we see is that the center of any Roman town was dedicated to commerce and to religion. It was also dedicated to Roman government, state government, because immediately adjacent to the Forum is the Basilica. Now, these days we use the term Basilica for a church, but in Roman times it was not a temple. The temple was this building number 2. Here, this building number 3 is a multi-purpose state building, and in fact the word Basilica simply defined out of Latin means a long hallway, and that's exactly what it was. It has the same basic format as the Forum does, except that it's roofed. And here you can see the inside of the basilica, where the columns separate the central area. There's the statue of the leader at the end, with the flat roof over the top of it. So it's very much similar to the layout of the Forum, but in fact roofed all the way across. Now, when I talk about how important Roman city planning is, this really formed the basis for much of the planning of Washington, D.C., where you can see that we actually have our Cardo, the north-south street, which is North Cap, and then, of course, our Decimanus, which would be the east-west street, which would be East Cap, and ending up on the Mall. In many ways, our Forum is the National Mall, and instead of a temple at the end, well, maybe we do have a temple at the end, but, as opposed to a basilica, we have our House of Government, the Capitol building, and really at the far end, we could talk about the Lincoln Memorial as presenting something of a state temple as well. Now, as we continue to look at the layout of Pompeii, we were looking at the Forum, which is here in Pompeii, the oldest part of town, but it continued to grow, spreading outward over the years. And on the outskirts of town, there was a major amphitheater for entertainment, one of the earliest surviving Roman amphitheaters, and as you probably heard from mythologies and rumors and whatnot, yes, there were gladiator combats, wild animal hunts, and so forth, staged in these public arenas. So the city plan was laid out as logically as possible, wherever possible, at least at the beginning, and then, of course, it would spread along the idea of just continuing that grid every direction. Another thing to mention about early Roman building is the importance of another innovation that they brought to the Western tradition, and that's the use of concrete. There's a discussion of this in your text. Roman concrete were larger rocks and pieces of pottery that were held together by ash. This, unlike sort of cement, which you're used to seeing, which is a lot more of the filler and a lot less of the stone. Here we have quite large stones, which is typical of Roman concrete. It's light, it's cheap, it's flexible, easier to use, quicker to build with than cut stone. This made Roman buildings some of the fastest and most efficient to ever be built. The problem is, of course, is that it's somewhat ugly, as you can see with this exposed concrete. And so what the Romans did was they covered it with painted plaster. The earliest Roman wall decorations tried to look like marble slabs. They basically molded the plaster so that it sat up in 3 dimensions and looked as if there were thin slabs of marble placed up against the wall. But this is all trickery. It's simply plaster that's been marbleized, right? And here we see another view of it as well. These marbleized pieces of plaster to look more expensive, fancier than they really are, but also simply to cover up that horrible Roman concrete. Historians call this the first style of Roman wall painting, and it was popular in the 3rd century all the way to the beginning of the 1st century BC. This was followed by a new innovation in wall painting, what we call the second style, where in the 1st century we begin to see the painters decorating the walls in an illusionistic way. What they're trying to do is to make this flat surface look like it's 3-dimensional, so they paint it with a sense of foreshortening. There's a ledge on which these figures are standing. It opens up to the area behind it. It seems to be 3-dimensional. This is the hallmark of the second style of Roman wall painting. It's not always figural. It doesn't always focus on the human figure as this house in Pompeii does. We also see other second style paintings that try to emulate landscape. Here, the Villa of Livia shows us this gardenscape. It's really totally beautiful gardenscape, rendered in great dimensions, where we can see a small wicker fence in the foreground leading to a sort of central walkway that's fenced off from the wilds around it. And as we look around the room, we can see that how really effective that illusionism is. That copse of trees, birds flitting around, keep turning around here in space, and we can see that, in fact, as we look to the opposite corner, how really deeply satisfying the illusionism of this work is. and how very detailed it is. Look at flowers and birds and fruit in the trees, as well as a sort of atmospheric perspective. As things get murkier, the deeper in space they go. But again, this interest in light and realism in the second style of Roman wall painting. Finally, a third example of the second style of Roman wall painting can be found here in the Metropolitan Museum in New York from Bosco Reale, where we see that here, instead of human figures or landscape, we have architectural painting. And you can see also that the illusionism is still quite strong. There's a small fountain here in the foreground. We step back into space, through a wall, and we see an area that's been screened off with a temple in it. And the surrounds of that temple almost looks like a forum, doesn't it? Here, with columns on either side receding into space. So a great sense of three-dimensionality in architectural painting. So this illusionism is the key to second style Roman wall painting. And we'll look a little bit more closely at it in the next art fix.